To set the tone for this, I want to begin by conjuring up a kind of a faintly melodramatic image. Flashing lights in the fog at 4:40 a.m. on the 21st of March 1918 signalled both a beginning and an end. British and French soldiers who were shocked from their beds hurried forward into trenches to watch with fear and trepidation. Behind them, American men were stepping off ships and being rushed east towards the front. The men of these three nations were a varied mix. They were the skilled and the fortunate, the veterans and the recruits, the survivors and the yet to be tested. However, as the flashing lights resolved themselves into the largest artillery bombardment the war had seen, the situation changed irrevocably. The relationship between British, French and American soldiers and the evolutions it had undergone, the confused early meetings, the joys, the despairs, the triumphs and the disasters, were about to be placed under a pressure and strain that was even more cloying and suffocating than the mustard gas falling at flaky air. The enemy's spring offensive had begun. Thousands of German soldiers had been redeployed from the eastern front to the west. Their aim was to split the Allied armies apart. They were about to advance, and as shells began to drop amongst the Allies, the men of the Entente nations had nobody left to reach out to and trust in but each other. Time had run out for further attempts at perfecting relations. The alliance between Britain, France and America had to work, and it had to hold, and it had to do so now. That's probably as melodramatic as we're going to get over the next hour or so. Before the outbreak of the First World War, Britain, France and the United States of America did not appear to be a natural triumvirate of allies. Britain and France had no real history of mutual cooperation, with their joint efforts in Crimea little more than a kind of confused blip set against the historic backdrop of rivalry, distrust and conflict. Franco-American relations had been warmer over the preceding 100 years, but even then their most notable attempts at military cooperation had basically been designed at annoying Britain. The Americans still remained resolutely neutral and largely disinterested in European affairs in 1914, so had no position in the original Entente Cordiale. It was an alliance that did not require Britain to actually do anything that it didn't want to. It also included the Russians far to the east, the country who had been the opposition for Franco-British efforts at Crimea. However, by 1918, the Americans had been drawn into a conflict effectively replacing Russia, who had sued for peace before collapsing into revolution and civil war. The direction and the course of the First World War was governed, given the numbers of men involved in the fighting, by actually a very few people. Leading politicians and the heads of the respective militaries decided on the overall strategy and focus of the war effort. However, whilst each of the Allies shared the same overall goal of victory, they were also concerned with their own spheres of responsibility and their own national interests. So in many ways, the men who decided the strategy became the embodiments of their own national interests, and were charged with protecting them. And this is certainly the case if you look at the orders given to Sir John French for the deployment of the original British Expeditionary Force to France in 1914. And it didn't evolve much further than that in the years that followed. The interactions between the commanding generals and their aides therefore took on a kind of particular dynamic. Discussions about imminent strategy and the movement of armies were undeniably important matters, but these discussions could often become bogged down and entrenched over a myriad of issues ranging from who had operational command, who's going to be resupplying, who's going to be moving people via which trains, and who had overall control of any particular theatre of war. So the final goal of the coalition was victory, but the manner in which it was pursued highlighted the very kind of specific weaknesses of large-scale coalition warfare. Further to this, none of the primary combatants wished to achieve a victory that actually weakened themselves and elevated all of their allies to a position of further strength. On top of this, all of the major generals of all of the major Allied armies were essentially completely disinterested in how their own soldiers would get along with each other. So they let all forms of Allied interaction below themselves kind of founder or flourish pretty much by themselves, entirely undirected. So below this kind of world of high strategy and national bargaining, you see a different world of national interaction. If the activities of the leading generals and politicians represented the First World War being governed by a small group of men under maximum focus and direction, then the opposite clearly lay in the huge numbers of soldiers who encountered each other with no interference or direction from anyone really above them. From examining the records that these men kept of their meetings with the strangers from foreign lands, who had become their principal allies, it is widely apparent that the political disputes and considerations of generals and wartime leaders did not reach down into the trenches and translate into anything real or that they could relate to. It is also clearly apparent that the notions of a singular British or French personality or representative that embodies the whole is very far from reality. What I want to do with this paper is show just how varied and complicated the British and French armies were during the First World War, and just how this impacted upon their relationships with each other. They were metropolitan and cosmopolitan, rural and colonial. The breadth and depth of the different elements that made up these armies is only matched by the desire on both sides to actually find a single identity with which they could define the other one. To begin with, we have to understand that many British and French soldiers were not even entirely sure what their allies looked like. Lieutenant Edward Spears, in August 1914, found himself accosted by French soldiers because his strange uniform was unfamiliar to them, and they jumped to the conclusion that I was a German prisoner. Spears had been already pushing for the creation of postcards and coloured plates depicting the British Army uniforms, and for them to be dispersed amongst French soldiers to avoid this type of thing, and he credits Colonel MacDonough, head of intelligence, for achieving this miracle before the Battle of Charleroi. Also, the Daily Mirror published a series of cartoons in September of 1914 by W.K. Haselden that attempted to examine the relationship between Britain, France, Germany, and kind of Europe as a whole. These cartoons were appearing in print once the war had already started, so Britain and French soldiers had already met each other by this point. Yet they still speak of a difficulty in perception of the French. The cartoon of the 15th of September gave a representation of the Entente Cordiale as a unified creature, to which the Kaiser had neither answer nor defence. And can we see there, he's basically saying, never mind your grouse, that's the bird I should like to bring down, but he's too strong. However, the cartoons that followed this in the days subsequently reveal, if not an outright suspicion of France and the French, then at least a form of confusion about them and possibly Europe in general. This is the spy mania before the war, and we see here Smith uses his camera, he is seized by soldiers, he is cast into prison and searched, he is dragged before the Minister of the Interior, he is examined by the Minister of War, and then escorted out of the country. And the text below explains, we may have been unprepared for spies in England, but on the continent they were certainly not. There was a period when, in Germany at least, an unoffending tourist had only to take a photograph in order to be arrested. Now this seems a fairly typical kind of piece of wartime propaganda with a very clear message. The Germans are both distrusting and untrustworthy through their use of spies, while the British are inexperienced in dealing with espionage because they are not underhanded enough to use it. The interest in this cartoon, however, comes from the fact that the foreign soldiers don't appear to be German at all, they're French. Whilst misidentification is of course possible, I do not believe this to be an error. The men all wear the kepi, which is that kind of distinctive hat, an item that had long held French connotations and did not appear in the military uniforms of any other European nation at the time, although it was worn by American Confederate soldiers during the Civil War. Furthermore, it's not like the German uniform was not composed of some fairly obvious distinguishing features of its own, particularly in headgear. And there's no helmets there with big spikes on top. Additionally, this particular image being used as a reference point, had been used as a reference point for the French in cartoons and in images since 1840 and 1850, where following the dictatorships of Cavaignac and Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, there was an evolution in the iconography used to personify France, with the communist symbol of Frenchness being the army uniform and fashionable military moustache and goatee. The suggestion of a French military unfairly persecuting an innocent man also likely has its roots in the British perception of the Dreyfus affair, which would also have been a recognisable reference to the British public in newspapers at the time. Haselden himself was also not ignorant as to the character of the French military uniform, as was proved by a cartoon published then subsequently, which is called What the Channel Tunnel Folks Think Now. We see watchfulness will not prevent the enemy getting through, so initially they're hidden in barrels of turnips and other vegetables. No use flooding the tunnel, he will come through anyway, and it shows a variety of soldiers all marching through underwater, and also the whole French army sent over in a few minutes by this method, which appears to be by cannon. Again, The final panel of the cartoon clearly identifies the soldiers as French, and once again we should note the clear portrayal of the French kepi acting as an indicator of the soldier's nationality. The only difference in the soldiers of this one with this one is that the soldiers in this cartoon appear to be carrying a little bit of extra weight. French depictions of the British Army, particularly following the Battle of the Marne and the Aisne in 1914, gave less room for obvious caricature, but at the same time was marked by the sort of stereotype born of reality that came to define early French judgments of their British compatriots. Here we have the first image shows the gunners of a French 75 saluting the efforts of their British friends. The British soldiers themselves are not shown in any great detail, but what we do see is the clear uniforms, military sabres and unshaven faces, and that's a familiarity that we'll come back to. Similarly, this image of British soldiers during the Battle of the Aisne replicates an image of cleanly shaven British soldiers doing their duty while also going about life as normal. The difference in presentation between the British and the French is perhaps best highlighted by the national interpretation of facial hair. British soldiers Hugh Bellew and Lieutenant Lionel Tennyson in particular serve as good representatives for the British view that being clean-shaven and smart in appearance is an important aspect of being a soldier. On the 25th of August, Bellew wrote that it would make you weep to see our wounded with about a fortnight's beard on them and clothes torn to pieces and no kits. Whilst on the 27th of August he noted that he saw a brigade of Royal Horse Artillery pass here yesterday, all with beards, you would not know them. On the 3rd of September he wrote to his mother saying, "You would laugh to see our troops with beards, the officers as well, it would make father envious." By contrast, Tennyson, writing near to a company of Zouaves on the 17th of September 1940, criticised the French soldiers and in particular the captain and lieutenant, who had beards and were very unsmart to look at, as all the French troops are. Now, whilst Tennyson and Bellew viewed as being unsmart as an implied consequence unfit for duty, the French viewed the French soldiers as being unfit for duty, as Smith, Audon, Rousseau and Becker write, the French soldiers were particularly proud of being this. War was, after all, a dirty business, and the defence of La Patrie could not be successfully undertaken whilst the defenders themselves, without them becoming immersed in their own soil and their own national mess, if you like. Even the nickname Poilu, a nickname that the French soldiers gave themselves, means the hairy ones. The divergence of ideology between the British and the French would eventually lead to pointed French criticism of their allies 2 years later on the Somme, and we'll come back to that a little later on. Fernand Laurent, who was a French interpreter assigned to the British, showed a remarkably accurate eye for differences between the British and the French, and would note how the British Army seemed entirely focused on enforcing similarity of appearance and outlook, even to the extent that British officers began to appear identical. He wrote, "When we look at many British officers together, we cannot fail to be struck by their extraordinary similarity in appearance. Our allies resemble each other like brothers. They do not just look like each other in the strict regularity of the uniform. This resemblance is found even in their faces. Take 2 French lieutenants. One wears a jacket of the lightest skyline blue, the other, from the rear services, the old dark blue coat. One wears a belt of tan English leather, the other is content with the old black regulation belt. One has the so-called summer flat cap, the other the high cap, encircled by 2 stripes. One is bearded, the other has on his upper lip only the lightest shade of a small American-style moustache. Among our allies, there is nothing comparable. The Kitchener, whether at the front or rear, is an invariable type repeated without significant difference, thousands and thousands of times. Khaki tunics cut to exactly the same model, and produced for most part by the same tailor, do not lend themselves to any variation of colour, and are consistently done up with the Sam Brown belt. The forage cap, or flat cap, is no less resistant to the imagination. And finally, it seems that in order to put the finishing touches to this ensemble, that even the faces of our friends should be formed from a single mould. The same strong features, often very regular, the same impeccably shaved chins. A few years ago, while the Prince of Wales himself was beardless, British officers were entitled to shave completely. Today they have to keep the moustache, and the Prince Captain is very proud of the power, thanks to his own down of a 20-year-old to comply with the order. Moreover, our allies wear only the bare minimum of hair, and this light shadow, carefully measured, adds to the uniformity of their appearance. The result of this resemblance gives an impression of sharpness, of correctness, and elegance, of which one cannot deny the excellent effect. This discussion over the differences in facial hair is particularly relevant and interesting considering the mixed reaction the heavy beards and moustaches of the French poilus elicited from the British soldiers in 1914. Laurent will go so far as to say that the British were almost unnaturally preoccupied with maintaining their appearance. He said, "Our brave allies, as everyone knows, have two main concerns, making their tea and shaving. No danger can distract them from these two preoccupations." And if you look at these two chaps here, they appear to be making tea, whilst also being heavily under fire. Whilst it might be simple to overly dwell on the apparently cosmetic nature of British criticism of the French, there was likely an additional motivating factor behind them that both drove this criticism and also defined its focus. There was no denying the fact that the British officer corps were principally drawn from the higher social classes to the rank-and-file soldier. The impression of class was further ingrained into the British Army through the nature of their uniforms, with working-class recruits being statistically shorter than their officer counterparts by around 5 inches. They wore uniforms produced en masse that were often ill-fitting and baggy. Officers wore uniforms made to measure by a tailor, purchased at the recruit's expense, but when worn, provided a far more authoritative image. When considering that some of Tennyson's principal criticisms against the French in August and September, whilst they focused on the appearance and activities of the French army, they can also be viewed as a criticism of the apparent lack of sophistication of the French. By not appearing dressed or shaved in the manner of the British army, they are also not appearing in the manner of a British gentleman. The inbuilt social hierarchy of the British Army did not evolve well to deal with the introduction of French soldiers who did not appear to fit with any acknowledged class sphere. Franziska Heimberger highlights the particular issue of French interpreters who were at best non-commissioned officers being refused entry to some British officers' messes as a result of the perceived discrepancy between the interpreter's actual rank in the French army and the rank he might have held in the British army due to his social standing. Defining the British and the French armies became more problematic as each side came to realise that Britain and France were actually made up of more countries and identities than they might otherwise have suspected. The definition of British autonomy by the French was much wider than that used by the British themselves. Joseph Aulneau, who spent a large portion of the war amongst Australian soldiers on the Western Front, still referred to it as the Front Britannique. The interpreter Laurent recognised the importance of accurate national distinction when dealing with the British Army. He wrote that, "Moreover, when we speak of the British Army, it is important not to forget that it is an assemblage of various diverse elements. English, Scots, Welsh, Irish, Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans are similarly dressed in khaki and present a uniform exterior. All are called by the general term of Britishers. However, scratch the colour and you will see that the particularity, nationalism and provincialism of each body who fights thus under the banner of the Empire remain extremely powerful. It is therefore necessary that the interpreter recognises these distinctions and regulates his words and actions accordingly." French soldiers who did not regulate their words and actions accordingly were liable to incur animosity from some soldiers in the British Army. One soldier, J.P. Fowler, referred to the French as a lot of bloody thieves and robbers. It seems that this antipathy towards the French stems from their habit of referring to him as Angleterre, where it's got his response of, "No Angleterre here, Scotch." Fowler's annoyance that the French have failed to recognise his Scottish nationalism and labelled him simply as being English, so not even covered by the British caveat, creates a situation where the French are an extension, albeit a largely unwitting one, of Fowler's own national conflict with the English. Meanwhile, the British began to have more substantial contact with French colonial soldiers, and the results provided moments of real shock and concern for British soldiers. On the 20th of September 1914, Bellew recalled how some Moroccan mounted troops came through here the other day. One chap had a German head in his bag, others had German hands and ears as souvenirs. On the 23rd of September, Lieutenant Lloyd reported there was a wagon proceeding from the firing line with 12 German prisoners captured by the French and guided by 2 Turcos. On reaching Braine, blood was to be seen trickling from the back of the wagon. The little civilised guard had killed them all, one Turco being found with a German's head in his haversack. This entry is, when viewed against the general tone of Lloyd's other notes, probably the closest that he ever gets to actually being genuinely shocked by anything, and the use of the word civilised perhaps highlights Lloyd's assumption and expectation of a certain level of behaviour from the Allied forces. On the 28th of September, he makes a further comment on the fighting lust of the French African native, having witnessed a Turco leaping onto the back of a German prisoner and biting his ear. Atrocities by Allied forces occupy a very difficult place within this literature, as the VEF soldiers make numerous references to the crimes committed by the German invaders in both France and Belgium, and point to these as justification for prolonged armed resistance. Therefore, examples of colonial soldiers murdering prisoners and taking souvenirs must have caused some consternation within the ranks of the VEF. It also raised questions about the nature of nationality. Whilst the French were to the British other, there are degrees of otherness. For all the confusion and lack of understanding about the French nature and nation, they were at least fellow Europeans, with a more directly shared racial and intersecting history, whilst colonial soldiers wore the colours of European nations, be they French Africans or British Indians. They were a far more removed and disconcerting form of other. Now, in his 2006 PhD thesis entitled The British Infantry and Atrocities on the Western Front of 1914 to 1918, Paul Hodges suggests, and he uses corroborating evidence from General Mangan, that the initial decision to use colonial soldiers in Europe was influenced by German fears regarding such men. Hodges also suggests that at the start of the war, the popular British view of colonial soldiers and Indians in particular was not favourable and was heavily influenced by persisting memories of the oddly generated, and that's oddly generated in British eyes, Indian mutinies during 1857. And the British authorities were forced to launch a kind of sustained multi-platform propaganda campaign in an attempt to correct these negative perceptions. When it came to the way the British soldiers then interacted with colonial soldiers, there were, according to Hodges, a number of threads that dominated British soldiers' contemporary texts, and these were first and dominant amongst these were reports of their savagery in battle, generally of the most brutal or exotic or primitive kind. In particular, the collection of enemies' ears or heads was frequently and vividly described. Allied to this was the commonly expressed feeling of, thank God they're on our side. These views were founded on the notions of savagery of non-white soldiers or warriors, and was always referred to, but they also recognised the bravery and military efficiency of colonial soldiers brought to bear on the Allied side. Indeed, often British soldiers seemed intent on powerfully conveying the message that the military effectiveness and courage of colonial troops stemmed from their uncompromising methods of waging war, although sometimes this was undercut by notions of the possession of a more primeval, natural or animalistic skill set than the Western troops. More subtly detectable is the sense that, in a similar way to which thoughts of the bayonet's brutish and intimidating efficiency were a helpful prop to British troops in the trenches, the thought of non-white Allied colonial troops' skill and savagery in attacking the enemy were also acting as a comfort to Tommies. Now, the result of these considerations was a mixed scenario of kind of shock and appreciation regarding the exploits, both real and rumoured, of their exotic allies, that formed a kind of Western Front Orientalism. Ear collecting, along with gore-filled accounts of beheadings, were among the most popular reports of non-white allies' behaviour made by British troops. They combined neatly pungent implications of Orientalist exoticism and savagery, but also in that the colonial troops could execute these beheadings and amass these collections of ears. Military efficiency was recognised, particularly in skillful infiltration, impressive raiding, and deadly hand-to-hand combat. There is an additional undercurrent to this. Whilst these atrocities and their perpetrators are made to seem decidedly other in the writings of the British soldiers, Hodges explains that Indian troops often treated prisoners of war far better than the neighbouring British did. Indeed, his thesis as a whole documents numerous accounts of atrocities committed by British soldiers, with the execution and murder of German prisoners being a constant thread. The British soldiers such as Lloyd and Bellew may well therefore have been shocked by the apparently brutal actions of the French colonial soldiers they saw, but the deaths of German prisoners at British hands were not seen as being a racial or a national issue. What results is a situation where there seem to be different degrees of atrocity, divided along racial and cultural lines, where one form of prisoner abuse is kind of all right, and the other one involves the abuse, murder and mutilation, and is decidedly not all right. At this point, you might be forgiven for wondering how exactly the British and the French soldiers ever made their alliance work. There were three key periods in Tommy Poilu relations. There was distance in 1914, there was unity in 1960, and then there was fracture in 1918. Having already seen how some of the distance was formed in the war's earliest years, for this to have changed by 1960 might at first glance appear to be odd. However, It is important to remember that the British Army of 1914, the professional and fairly highly skilled original British Expeditionary Force, had been replaced by civilian volunteers. The men of Kitchener's new armies were civilians first and foremost, and they'd signed up in 1914 and early 1915. They were not soldiers. More to the point, they seemed to know that they weren't soldiers. The French, by comparison, had been through a process of at least 2 years military service. Therefore, it should not be overly surprising if the newly arrived British men were slightly intimidated by their French compatriots and were measuring their own efforts against the bar that the French had set. Some soldiers believed that they were coming up short in that test. The officer classes in particular, having volunteered in 1914 and undergone their training before reaching the front in 1915 and 1916, had been instructed in methods and techniques relating to historical battles, such as Minden, Albufeira and Waterloo, and the Battle of the Pyramids, only to find that upon joining their battalion, they became acutely conscious of how little they actually knew. When and where do these emotions provoked by a British inferiority complex and a lack of self-esteem actually come from, when compared to the French? Is it a case of the British feeling a lack of self-confidence and then they meet the French, or is it vice versa? Now, there's a danger of falling into a kind of post hoc ergo propter hoc explanation of the dynamic here. The soldiers of the new armies had only recently undergone army training, a process designed to fill the recruits with confidence in their own abilities and, more importantly, with the ideals of the military institution. So at what point did this self-confidence begin to evaporate? Was it lost somewhere on the ship as it kind of crossed over the channel? What I would contend is that rather than setting the dominant tone of self-assurance over uncertainty, the military training that these men went through was the anomaly in this process rather than the norm. From the moment they signed up to the army to the time they entered the training regime, these men may have had a rough idea about what the nature of war and what they were about to experience, but they were not professional soldiers and they wouldn't have thought of themselves as such. During the training process, this would conceivably have changed as they were taught the martial skills they would supposedly need to both survive and triumph in France. However, how likely was all of this to fully change their self-evaluation and reflection? During their deployment, while still enveloped by the military institution, it is only reasonable that degrees of stress would start to come into play. The transition from Britain to France and from home front to Western front would have brought about feelings of anticipation and excitement, but also of nervousness, particularly as these men began to hear fighting and the guns in the distance. The arrival in the trenches had represented kind of the final step in this development process, and this deployment was also often the moment that some of the soldiers began to recognise the deficiencies in their own training. The French did not create this lack of self-confidence in the British, but they did give it a recognisable form. The British soldiers didn't yet fully recognise what they were, but they could look at a French soldier and know, I am not yet that. Now, the lack of composure felt by some British soldiers under fire in comparison to the French was commented on by a Lieutenant Bleu when he was given a tour of French frontline trenches across the River Somme. During this visit, Bleu would also be provided with a new view of some of the dangers of life in the frontline trenches and how the French seemed to be coping with it. He wrote in his diary, "These trenches were the scene of desperate attacks and counter-attacks during the Frise battle and have been flattened out many a time. In one trench in which we were, Godin, who's the guy who's giving him a tour, told me that the fiercest fighting of all had taken place, and it was full to the parapet with dead and wounded on several occasions, and it looked like it. We were shelled continually during the afternoon, and the infantry there had many casualties. It was quite the hottest corner I have been in yet, and I did not care for it a bit. The French infantry did not take the slightest notice of it. Their behaviour was perfectly marvellously plucky. They are the Zouaves, picked colonial troops, and I know now what is meant by seasoned troops and steadiness under fire. I spoke to one of them, a sentry standing right up on the parapet with shells pitching all around him, and asked him what he thought of it. He laughed loudly and said, 'Ah, c'est rien, c'est ici toujours comme ça,' just as one might say, 'It's always raining nowadays.' I was very distinctly pleased to get back over the river at about 6 p.m. after having tea with the officers of a 75mm battery. Now, the notion of these French soldiers constituting an elite and displaying the benefits of their heightened martial ability in contrast to Bleu, who was clearly unnerved by the whole experience, does add to the suggestion that the British troops believed they were lacking in something, whether it was simple experience or some kind of more intangible military quality when compared with their French allies at the time. Alongside this, however, is the apparent genuine friendliness and camaraderie exhibited by the French towards their British neighbours. There is often a military logic behind this. With the above example, for instance, we see that the French are pointing out important areas of German trenches to Blore, but behind that there is still a real warmth and a sense of shared community. These aspects were not simply limited to Blore's experience. A soldier called Stansfield will comment that the French soldiers near him are A1 splendid fellows and very anxious to be friendly. Shortly before the launching of the Somme offensive, Blore would reflect on the apparent differences between the French and British men. And he said, "There is a complete difference between the soldiers of the two nations. The Britisher is a boy in size and looks and manners, whilst the French are all men, bearded and manly looking. Even their drivers are great big fellows, weighing on average 12 stone. Our little 5-foot jockeys look most amusing beside them." Such sentiments do once again raise this issue of the British feeling a sense of inferiority when compared to the soldiers of the other principal combatants, in a way that will also strike at their very masculinity. The French seemed distinctly more masculine than the British, both through their appearance and their martial confidence in which they held themselves. Captain Bursey would also remark that, whilst he'd heard they were short on rations, the French troops certainly do not look like it, for they were very fit. It is also worth noting that during his visit to those French trenches, Blore was talking about colonial soldiers being so calm and elite under fire, the same sort of men that British soldiers had found so barbarous earlier on in the war. Previous stereotypes or fears about these other French were beginning to melt away following extended periods of contact with them. Also during 1916, Lieutenant Stansfield would dine in the French sergeant's mess at the nearby hospital. Whilst his diary presented a much shorter version of this evening, his letter home to his mum offered an experience of an expansion of several key aspects, where he seeks to describe not only the evening, but also the other guests. It was a unique experience, both for the food that I ate and for the company that I was in. The latter included a Paris solicitor, a Martinique Negro, and this is in brackets. This sounds dreadful, but he was an awfully nice chap. A portly, black-whiskered and typically French sergeant, whose wife and children were at present in the invaded portion of France without any means of communication with him, a Parisian tapestry worker, in brackets, a perfect dandy, and others. Now, the description of the character of the Martinique Negro is particularly revealing here, and it doesn't appear in his diary. He's just referred to as a Martinique Negro. There is an undeniably racist element to the extract, but the question is, in which way is it directed? Is it Stansfield who is admitting that he was surprised at how this man turned out to be good company, or is he attempting to preempt the likely reaction of his mum? In likelihood, it's probably a mix of the two, but this is another stereotype that starts to kind of be exploded following a period of contact. What we consistently see during 1916 is British soldiers deferring and reaching out to their French allies, who would in turn extend their services both as hosts and as teachers towards the British, and allow relationships to form that superseded any form of military rivalry. This would allow the British and the French to communicate on a more personal level that would reap precious dividends for the rest of the war. Now, that's not to say that all forms of confusion about national identity just stopped as soon as 1916 rolled around. On the 15th of March, Lieutenant McArdle recounted in his diary the results of a meal he and some of his companions had had, and they'd shared it with a French soldier a few nights before. He said, "They are a strange people. So undoubtedly are we. A Frenchman dined with us the other night. He was silent and reserved, a handsome little man, with dark hair and a lovely rich dark colour in his skin. I think he felt embarrassed with our languages, but suddenly, after some casual remark of ours, he burst into glittering animation. 'Ah, but to die in the moment of victory,' he sighed ecstatically. 'Who would be sad?' We all looked rather foolish and uncomfortable. We felt it would be the very limit to die in the hour of victory, and rather lost for a suitable reply. 'Well, I don't know,' some brave man murmured. 'I'd be rather fed up.' Our guest lapsed again into unbroken silence. What barbarians they must think us." Now, further to this, McArdle was still dwelling on the notion of national character in mid-April, and he outlined it in a very lengthy part of his diary. One night he was writing, "Underneath me, 3 men were singing Un peu d'amour. I sat on my bed with a cigarette and indulged in a reflection on the artistry of the French. It was pleasant to find justification for a preconceived idea, and I had seen little among the French peasantry before to support the notion that they were all dreamers, idealists and sentimentalists. But here below me were 3 soldiers on leave singing softly and sweetly over their native wine one of the Muses' loveliest love songs. The soft harmony of their voices rather saddened me. Theirs was surely a truer sentiment than the sort of our Tommies love. They were not ashamed to be sad. My heart softened on the French, who had disgusted me with their filthy habits of their poorer classes. All at once I loved them. The singing stopped, glasses clicked below. They were drinking to La Belle France, or to Jean and Marie and Felice. Then they started it again, but they had changed their tune. Oh my, I don't want to die, I want to go home. I went down and peeked into the estaminet. There were 3 of my own men there, drinking beer, and that was all the company. I went to my window and looked out on the sloppy street and drenched lines of miserable horses in a vacant lot on the other side of it. Something had depressed me, the rain, and furthermore, perhaps being tricked into loving the French and finding it was only Tommy who I had always loved but not quite understood. Now, there are several important elements of this fairly complicated errantry by McArdle that need to be analysed and understood. First amongst these is McArdle's admission that he had formulated a set of particular stereotypes of the French peasantry based upon a particularly romantic concept, but that he had seen little evidence for it since arriving in France. That McArdle, or any other British soldier for that matter, had some preformed views is not particularly surprising. But this clear statement of it shows how McArdle had anticipated his interactions with the citizenry and the elements in their behaviour he had been looking for. It is also apparent that McArdle is initially relieved to have this preconceived idea validated, as it meant that he would not have to alter his existing model for understanding the French. Additionally, the singing of the ersatz Frenchman has the effect to soften McArdle's approach to the citizenry, who apparently had previously disgusted him. However, his diary entries carry no indication of this disgust. In fact, the French civilians are barely mentioned in it at all. This reaction must clearly have been internalised by McArdle, and as a result, it is difficult to fully recognise how and when it influenced his actions. However, this softening towards the French is ultimately shown to be misplaced, as the Free Soldiers turn out to be British. McArdle is initially depressed by this realisation, but this swiftly evolves into a more complicated intellectual crisis, as he writes that he had been tricked into loving the French and finding out it was only Tommy who he had always loved but not quite understood. In his attempts to understand the French, McArdle had once again been forced to return to his fellow Britons and attempt to decipher them. Now, over the course of 1916, diaries and letters from British soldiers become filled with references to drinking and eating with French soldiers, visiting each other's trenches, and, when necessary, grieving with each other over shared losses. For their part, the French troops were kind of bemused and dispirited by British attacks around the Somme, and at times struggled to rationalise the British behaviour, as indicated by the original research, or the initial research conducted into the French postal censorship records by Elizabeth Greenhalgh. She wrote that criticism of British foolhardiness invited comparisons which are always, as is well known, invidious. One French career artillery officer implied that excessive British bravery was the result of pride. His introduction to service in the Somme sector gave proof of the British commitment, as he found himself surrounded by the British, both living and dead, he wrote to his wife on the 30th of September. The British are astonishingly brave and calm. They take no precautions at all, are very nice and seem to admire us. They seem to prefer to be killed than to get dirty, and don't throw themselves to the ground as we do. They remain standing. It's very fine, but not very clever. No doubt lying flat on the ground seems to them to be cowardice. However, the enduring image and impression that emerges from these 1916 postal censored records for the French army actually kind of begin to replicate some of the experiences found within the diaries of the British soldiers at the time. The French were certainly dubious about the abilities and inclination of the British to perform well on the Somme, and considering the apparent inferiority issues the British were wrestling with at the time, those concerns were not specific to the French. These French concerns would then largely diverge along lines of distance, with those in 6th Army, who were closest to the British, beginning to be convinced about their allies' ability before the men of, say, the 5th Army, which were further away. It was often said that the spirit of the British, which won over the French allies, or at least acted as a starting point to build upon, the bravery or courage of the British soldiers was repeatedly commented upon, even during periods where the British were struggling to make significant gains against determined German opposition. In its own way, this perhaps represents a clear divide in the minds of the French soldiers between their appreciation of the instrument of attack, which was the soldiers themselves, and the orchestrators, who were the generals. They could show a strong appreciation for the work of the British soldier and recognise some of the traits that they often viewed in themselves, without necessarily tying it into the tactics, strategies and decisions being imposed upon them by those above. This period of war is perhaps best indicated by images such as these, where British and French soldiers share a mutual purpose and spirit, if not language. I can't remember where I found that picture of a British and a French soldier spanking the Kaiser. but I thought I'd put it in because it's kind of weird. It's from 1916, but in geeky terms, the French officer's wearing a 1914 uniform. But beyond that, it's just a picture of two men spanking someone in public. To understand how these workable and warmer feelings changed into an annoyance and an enmity that almost brought the alliance to a crashing end, we must now refer back to how this paper opened. The opening of Germany's Michael offensive on the 21st of March 1918 would see a huge blow fall upon the British trenches, particularly around Saint-Quentin. The British soldiers attempting to hold the position were rendered virtually impotent by heavy fog that reduced visibility to a matter of yards. Malcolm Brown described this as the unimaginable happening. Our western front line was being seriously breached and in an incredibly short time. After trying to hold the German assault for several days, the British eventually gave way and were overrun and forced onto the retreat. Now, at first, the French response was one of hope regarding their British allies, mixed with a kind of mild concern. The Germans took the offensive to the British, and the battle is terrible. Our friends were forced to retreat under the weight of numbers, but our area is sending reinforcements, and we are very confident that we will be able to stop it. However, as the fighting intensified, so too did the fears and concerns of the French soldiers, and eventually their anger. And this is from the French postal censorship records. Right now, we are on the Somme battlefield, called in by the inability of the English. We will certainly restore the situation, for us there's no doubt, but I assure you it was high time the French arrived, because the English were completely out of action. The battle takes place in open country, no more entrenched defences, and it is all down to the bravery and initiative of the French if the Boche is now stopped. Summations by the postal censors began to speak of rather severe criticism of the British concerning their retreat in the face of the Boche offensive, before evolving to suggest that, in relation to the English retreat, some of the soldiers bitterly find that the French resistance is always necessary and expensive, in itself beginning to be viewed simply as a mark of disparagement for the English. Accounts of individual soldiers within these reports also indicated the level of hostility towards the English. The English bastards have not been able to stop the Germans without our intervention. It's the same with the Americans. They want war, but not to be killed, so it is always the French who are the best cannon fodder. By the start of May, the mood amongst some French allies seems to have changed to a mix of despair and hatred when discussing their British allies, with some postal reports now containing an entirely new subheading simply for complaints about the British. Now, the British, for their part, never truly seemed to understand quite how badly their reputation and relationship was suffering with the French. To an extent, this is probably understandable. They were, after all, largely focused on surviving the German offensives that were hammering their lines and trying to drive a wedge between the two armies. What they were aware of, however, was the presence of a third Allied army on the Western Front, one which they were not particularly well disposed to, but that seemed to be getting on very well with the French army. I really like this picture because it kind of looks like the American guy in the middle is going, I'm sure you're all imagining why I brought you here today, but I'm really glad that I could help everyone cooperate. And there was no way in hell that they'd have put up with that. But I also put this picture on a t-shirt in an attempt to maybe see if I could hand it in instead of handing in a thesis at the end of my PhD. It doesn't work, if anyone else was thinking about it. But issues with the Americans became one of the running themes for the British across 1918. The new advances would bring the British Army into contact with the Americans, and the British did not find them particularly impressive, with the Second Lieutenant Wallace's testimony being indicative of this. He wrote, as troops, they were contemptible, inefficient and ill-disciplined, and as ordinary human beings to associate with, they were terrible. They were the sweepings of the city of New York, which appeared to me to mean the sweepings of Middle Europe and Russia. The sacred flame of democracy burned high in every breast and manifested itself in the grossest contempt of orders and the filthiest abuse in audible tones if one tried to enforce a necessary military order. I had officers who hunted out safe dugouts and sat in them all evening, leaving the men in charge of the NCOs, and the NCOs who then curled themselves up and went to sleep. Whilst the British had not shown a great deal of interest in or understanding of French politics, they appeared to be far more interested and scathing in their evaluation of what democracy had done to the Americans. They shirk orders, they responded with abuse and abandoned their commands. The Americans had seemingly been empowered by their democratic rights, but in the eyes of the British, it was an empowerment that had led to disorder, a sense of entitlement and a lack of respect for the natural military order of the army. It's hard not to view some of these accusations as again coming from the perspective of social class, the Americans and the Australians at earlier parts of the war seem to represent the fears expressed by a military institution marked and organised by social class of an enfranchised mass of civilians who have taken their rights and their powers to the extreme. Even in the world crisis, Winston Churchill hints at the alien nature of American democratic and constitutional politics from the British perspective, and intimates how the outcome of these proceedings could be an empowering and yet cutthroat business that had left America and Woodrow Wilson as essentially unknown quantities around the world. For the French, however, the framework for cooperation with America had been constructed much earlier in the war, beginning with the initial American volunteers who had joined the French army, continuing with the Escadrille Lafayette, fighter squadron, and culminating in their decision in 1917 to send Marshal Joffre to America to kind of rally further support for France in the war effort. Additionally, and in sharp contrast to England, where Pershing and the Americans had attracted little attention, the arrival of the American Expeditionary Force in France was greeted by wild scenes of celebration and mutual appreciation. Such festivities extended to the French announcement that they wished to stage a massive celebration in honour of American independence on the 4th of July. Now, as the AEF arrived in France, it was decided, following heated debates between the Americans, the British and the French, that American battalions and regiments would be placed temporarily with French divisions for training purposes, and in a limited fashion with the British. This is kind of largely known as the amalgamation crisis. Now, the Americans have been warmly welcomed into France at almost every level, with strong references being made by both sides to their joint revolutionary heritage. And the fallout of this amalgamation crisis regarding how the American soldiers would be used resulted in most American soldiers being at least temporarily integrated with the French army. These Americans achieved a level of proximity and interaction with the French in a remarkably short space of time that the British never really matched. By the time the French and Americans were operating together on the battlefield, they were already forging strong relationships that were only enhanced by the perceived turmoil going on in the BEF. Furthermore, by undergoing a period of interaction and integration with the French before being reconstituted into their own national army, the arriving Americans were the beneficiaries of a system that would have been ideal for the British during their arrival in 1914. Now, whilst this disagreement about how to use the Americans can be looked at as a matter of national sovereignty, it is also possible to see it as a result of evolving Allied strategies. Whilst both Britain and France wanted the American reinforcements to bolster their own armed forces and replace their own losses, they also both recognised that simply unleashing an unprepared American army onto the Western Front would be wasteful in both terms of life and time. However, French soldiers maintained a fair degree of political interest in events going on around the war, and with victory suddenly looming towards the end of 1918, the praise the Americans had garnered for their martial feats was almost undone when news of Woodrow Wilson's criteria for peace began to reach French soldiers, and this is taken from the French postal records again. The demand addressed by Germany to President Wilson is a pure insult to England and France. The American effort is immense, but it's not been for the whole of the war. While France and Britain want peace, we see the smile of the Kaiser sending his note to Wilson. The French and the English will respond by the guns of Marshal Foch. The Americans thus want an end to the war. We want to return to our homes, but we would be disappointed if the war was not carried onto German soil. Germany must pay for its crimes. The French soldiers admired the efforts of the Americans and were greatly appreciative of the work they had done, but they were not interested in having terms dictated to them, or worse, in their perception, forced upon them by America, which had sat out much of the fighting. Again from the records, what do you think of the Americans, is the question. Their successes are very good, but I think that after the war they will boast about what they have done, forgetting the very large contribution of the French and the English made for a long time before them. The Americans never thought they would enter this war. They are taking all the glory. And under a different heading of state of mind, opinions of the Allied troops. Slightly less praise for the American soldier. The English are doing well. As with the collapse in appreciation for the British coinciding with a kind of a rise in popularity for the Americans, so again we start to see a situation in reverse. The Americans do not fall so far as the British, and with their era being seen as political rather than military, this is understandable. What begins to emerge, therefore, may not have been a more carefully considered directing of praise from the French to their allies, but perhaps what could be more accurately described as a moment of considered clarity. The damage done to the French perception of the British never fully heals in the last weeks of the war, but there is an acknowledgement that whatever their mistakes, for the vast majority of the war, the French and the British really only ever had each other. There were great hopes for the Russians, and then there were later flirtations with the Americans, but neither of those really conclusively balanced out the efforts of the British soldiers who had been in for the long haul. So what begins to happen in the postal records for October and early November is a far wider appreciation of the British, certainly, but also acknowledgements of other allies who have now made up the victory. There were reports of great camaraderie with the English, and discussions of marching alongside brave Tommies by French soldiers currently under command of British generals, and perhaps most indicatively, talk of how the British actions have redeemed them after their dark hours of failure. The British were not alone in this sudden outbreak of warm civility amongst the French. The Americans still continued to be praised in a similar ways previously. Even the Belgian army suddenly began to receive commendations within the records, having barely appeared in any of them in any form beforehand. With the liberation of French soil now well underway and the armistice imminent, jubilation begins to break out amongst the French ranks, with letters crying, "Vive la France! Long live our brave allies!" However, alongside this, there is something more. There is a fair degree of triumphalism, of course, but accompanying the normal praise being offered to their allies is an extra level of appreciation for the British. Now, this is not just for their services during the war, but also for small moments at the end that allowed France to be French in its victory. Here again from the records. One thing that has particularly affected us, the delicate attention shown by the British troops who have deployed the French flag in Cambrai. The gesture has a double meaning, better than any speech. It says we are all soldiers of the same cause and the same army, but it also says that the English have taken Douai on behalf of the French, and it's for this that I thank them especially, because we are all brothers, not only in arms but in feeling. These are the things that the Germans cannot understand. In fairness, the Germans probably weren't the only ones who had failed to understand the relationship between the British and the French. The French themselves had had a clear idea of what they'd wanted from the British. What they got had to varying degrees frustrated, confused or surprised them. Whilst the 1916 period had been crucial for the British, with the travails of 1918 merely testing mainly testing their relationship with the French, it had nearly proved devastating for the French view of their ally. And the Americans and their arrival in particular had complicated this relationship. And if by November 1918 the French had not fully forgiven the British for their perceived failings earlier in the year, they had at least kind of become largely content with the services offered by their ally. The war was won, and that meant if the Allies had not been suitably French during the preceding years, they had done enough to be grateful to, and thus receive a measure of thanks at the conclusion. Now, relations between Britain, France and America soured in the post-war years. Recriminations over Versailles drove these three allies apart as the world of high politics once again came into play. Now, if Britain had no permanent friends and only permanent interests, then the same could be said of America and France. In kind of modern parlance, they were not exchanging Christmas cards. However, there were still signs remaining of what had once been. A memorial showing France surrounded by her allies was raised in Calais in 1926. However, like the Third Republic of France, it would not survive the Second World War. It was a victim of the bombs, the memorial was badly damaged and eventually destroyed. A new monument would have to take its place, whilst similarly a new alliance would be needed between Britain, France and the Free French as they went to war again. Now, the complicated nature of these alliances means it is difficult to say if they were ever truly now and forever. At various times during the war, it was none, some and both of these. But it endured and it lasted the duration and it did exactly what all of the major combatants would have wanted it to. And if it didn't do any more than that, it was still enough to win the war. Thank you very much.